Hamburg began. That's a collaboration between Oxford University St Hilda's College and Medical School Hamburg. For the second time, I'm hosting this event from Hamburg. And I think for the second time, the sun is shining when I came here. And right from the outset, I want to thank the Medical School Hamburg for their generous support of these events. And I also want to thank the principal and bursar of St Hilda's College for their generous support. The first event hosted from Hamburg was exactly 1 year ago today, in the spring, well not today, but in the spring of 2022. We were just coming out of the pandemic. The topic for that event was synesthesia and the brain. Now we had a few technical glitches at that event, and we've worked really hard to iron these out. And I do hope it all goes very smoothly tonight. But as this night, we have a three-way hookup between Yale in the United States, Oxford University, and Hamburg. We'll see. Let's hope it all goes smoothly. But the pandemic, since that time, technology has opened things up, and we can do these wonderful three-way events. So I think we've got to soldier on into the future with all our technology. Now, some of you will have come to these events before. In Oxford, there may be some regular attenders, but there'll be many who are attending for the first time. I welcome you all, the newcomers and regulars alike, in Hamburg and in Oxford. And I hope you'll find these talks really stimulating. We began the year with the topic of belief and the brain. We moved on last term to think about rationality and decision-making and the brain. And we're ending the year with the topic of delusion in the brain. The overarching idea was to think about belief. What is this mental state we call a belief? And then looked at what might be thought of as proper functioning belief in rational decision-making. And now we're going to look at what might be thought of as malfunctioning belief, delusions. In the first years, we chose a different topic each term, because this has now been running 8 years in Oxford. And we didn't really think too much about how the three topics fit together. We just had a separate topic each term. But in the last couple of years, we've begun to think of each year as having an overarching theme, and the three events as contributing in some way to that overarching theme. So next year, as Barnaby said, we have a rather exciting overarching theme, which is the senses. And we're going to look at taste in the autumn event, sound in the winter event, and touch next spring. And the dates should be in your program. I'm not sure you have them here in Hamburg, but we'll get them to you, so look out. For those who don't know the format of these events, we have three speakers, each who will approach the topic of the evening from the perspective of their particular discipline. I should explain, we do not ask the speakers to coordinate in any way, nor do we dictate how they should approach the topic. The point is simply to show how different disciplines, neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, each contributes to our understanding of a certain phenomenon. It's all too easy to think that one subject has cornered the market, so to speak, when it comes to understanding. Tonight's topic is a case in point. How are we to understand delusion? Let me take a step back. What is a delusion? Here are three definitions I found by looking at reputable sites online. Here's one from the Cambridge Dictionary. A belief is something that is not true. That's a delusion. A belief in something that is not true. Here's another definition that puts a bit of meat on the bones. A delusion is a false belief maintained in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence, apart from beliefs that are articles of religious faith. And here's a third one. A false belief or judgment about external reality held despite incontrovertible evidence to the contrary, occurring especially in mental conditions. So we start from a belief in something that's not true, and then we have the job of explaining why religious beliefs don't count as delusions, especially if we think along with the third definition that delusions occur in mental conditions or disorders. And the third definition as an interesting observation. Delusions are beliefs that are held despite incontrovertible evidence. So to tell us more about these curious beliefs, I'm now going to introduce our first speaker. And as I said, contrary to the program here in Hamburg at least, I hope we've got the program right in Oxford, we're starting with Will Koller. Will Koller is a fourth-year doctoral student at Yale University in the United States. He's interested in understanding the processes that contribute to the formation and the maintenance of beliefs that, as his website puts it, are out of sync with consensus reality. I like that. Out of sync with consensus reality. As well as understanding such beliefs, he's interested in the development of interventions that may help us to reduce the rigidity with which such beliefs are held. So I'm now going to introduce, I'm going to say over to you, Will. And you're going to come up on the big screen in 2 countries. That's not your own country. There you go.
Can you guys hear me okay?
We can see you in Hamburg. Can you see him all right in Oxford?
Yes. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here, albeit virtually. I wish that I could be joining in person. But yeah, through the miracle of technology, I'm happy to be here. So my name is Will Koller. I'm joining you from the Yale University Department of Psychology. Where I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate in clinical psychology. So in my research, I've studied how memory and learning processes may contribute to psychosis and psychotic experiences, including and in particular focus on delusions or delusion-like beliefs. And so as learned in my bio, I have some background in, I've had some interest in neuroimaging, especially as a clinical intervention in the form of real-time functional MRI feedback. And so this experience informs how I think about my research, although I will note that the current talk will focus primarily on behavioral findings. So without further ado, I'm excited to share my talk entitled Content Out of Context, in which I will explore how differences in how people organize their memory and time may act as a bridge that links everyday deja vu experiences and psychologicism. And just a quick note, I'm going to be using these different symbols to denote different sections of my talk, so background, methods, results, and conclusion. Alright, so what do I mean when I say psychologicism? So psychosis is often thought of in the context of schizophrenia, yet sub-threshold psychotic experiences extend across a continuum. So these can include odd perceptual experiences. So, seeing something out of the corner of your eye, returning to realize there's nothing there, as well as thought content that can be experienced as intrusive, salient, and strange feeling. And it's important to understand what gives rise to these experiences in the first place, given that one way that we can think about why delusions form is by considering them as a sort of explanation or a way to make sense of these odd experiences. So despite being characterized by the subjective sense of oddness, analogs of psychotic experience are in fact universal. We've all experienced moments of strange thinking, feeling, or perceiving. So as an example, take a second to imagine the last time you've experienced deja vu. You may notice that these experiences tend to be salient and intrusive. They kind of pop into your head out of the blue. They're often attention-grabbing, sometimes even unpleasant or have this kind of nagging sense about them. They tend to defy or demand explanation, at least at first, because you're kind of searching for some understanding of why you're feeling this way. And in general, it's characterized by this strange sense of recognition without deeper identification or contextualization. In fact, in pop culture, deja vu has come to convey this sense of hidden meaning in the world that lies just beyond our grasp. So, for example, in the Matrix series, moments of deja vu, such as this recurring black cat motif, represent a, quote, glitch in the matrix, right? So evidence that not all as it seems in our understanding of reality. The American psychologist William James, who has a quote for literally everything, sums up the odd subjective feeling that accompanies experiences like deja vu in the following passage. Wherever, in fact, the recalled event does appear without a definite setting, it is hard to distinguish it from a mere creation of fancy. For example, I enter a friend's room and see on the wall a painting. At first, I have this strange, wondering consciousness. Surely I've seen that before, but when or how does not become clear. It only clings to the picture, a sort of penumbra of familiarity. So this quote highlights how experience of recognition that are decoupled from source information may represent inherent challenges to our reality monitoring systems. They become, quote, hard to distinguish from the mere creation of fancy, as James puts it, and are accompanied by this strange, wandering consciousness. So what drives these odd experiences? Focusing on this conceptualizations of recognition without identification, along with William James's number of familiarity, we can imagine that there's something going on in the memory system, right, during these moments to cause an instance of recognition that lacks adequate source or context information to fully make sense of. Turning to neuroscientific models of memory, we can get some clues about the systems that may be responsible for this process of contextualizing our experience. In particular, we can focus on the hippocampus, depicted in the red box. And so we understand the hippocampus being involved in relational binding, through which different experiences become associated with one another. In this way, the hippocampus manages spatial, temporal, and associative relations. So in this example, which shapes were present and how they were arranged relative to one another. In this way, the hippocampus may help us to place our experiences in time following a recognition moment by recalling links of a chain of associations that organize our experience. So here, upon recognizing the yellow rhombus, the hippocampus can help contextualize it by calling up its associations with other objects. So in this case, okay, I remember that the rhombus preceded the blue triangle, the triangle preceded the purple triangle, so I must have seen it sometime close to the beginning of the sequence. So using this sort of relational information to sort our experience in time. So based on this model, it seems as though memory-related mechanisms may be related to these instances of recognition without source, which seem relevant to both everyday experiences like déjà vu and to more psychotic-like thought. This invites our guiding question. Might déjà vu and psychotic-like thought share certain memory-based mechanisms? In support of this idea, memory impairment precedes and predicts psychosis onset, which suggests that it may be causally involved in symptomagenesis. Further, in my own work, I found that individuals experiencing paranoia, which is a common aspect of psychotic experience, are more likely to falsely and overconfidently recognize a new item as old, especially if those items are accompanied by a general sense of familiarity. So this suggests an over-reliance on familiarity-based processes during memory retrieval. So this feels familiar, but I can't necessarily say why. That may lead to this sort of intrusion of context-relevant items that are simply sufficiently familiar to pass some threshold for recognition. This style of memory may increase the likelihood of instances of retrieval that are low in source information, but sort of burst into consciousness with high salience. So we set out to answer this question using a memory experiment that not only tested what people remembered seeing, but when they remembered seeing it. So we threw on one line of experiments. A total of 500 participants first completed a learning phase in which they saw a stream of objects one after another while completing a simple attention check. So it's this natural and man-made. And then they were then tested on their memory for what they saw. So here they were shown a pool of items that either came from the earlier learning phase or were novel, and were asked to judge simply whether each item was old or new. Importantly, if they judged an item as old, they were asked to use a slider that kind of represents the duration of the earlier learning phase to try to remember when they had seen this item. So this gives a very precise readout of people's ability to contextualize their memory in time. If they said new, on the other hand, we had people complete a non-memory-based slider question, just to make sure there were no major differences in how people use sliders in general. And then questionnaires, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. So these questionnaires included a paranoia scale, which has items such as I was convinced there's a conspiracy against me, as well as a schizotypy scale, which assessed 3 different symptom clusters. There are positive symptoms, which represent experiences sort of added on top of normative reality. So this includes things like I've had experiences with seeing the future, ESP, or sixth sense. There are disorganized symptoms, so most of the time I find it very difficult to get my thoughts in order. And then there are negative symptoms, which represent a reduction in function in things like mood and motivation. So throughout my life, I've noticed that I rarely feel strong, positive, or negative emotions. And so these first 3 categories made up our variable representing psychoticism, which is characterized by odd, distressing, or disorganized thought content. As a sort of within sample control, we want to compare this to negative symptoms, which are again characterized by low mood, reduced motivation, and asociality. So this helps us to understand if any differences in memory are related to psychotic-like thought per se versus more general distress. And then finally, we collected questions about the intensity of déjà vu experiences, such as how frequently would you say that you have experienced déjà vu. And so we're hypothesizing that people higher in psychoticism will likely perform worse on this task. But importantly, there are a couple of different ways that this may play out. So if we imagine that the true stream of objects that people saw during the learning phase is depicted in the top right, so apple and backpack and sign, it could be the case that people respond randomly. They say, oh, I think I saw the backpack pressing the sign of the apple. Just kind of ran across this whole mental timeline. On the other hand, you can imagine that people's memories of these items are fuzzy. They may feel as though all of these items appeared further in the past than they actually did. They all feel sort of distant, a sort of hypo-recency. Finally, you can imagine that if all items feel sort of familiar, people may take them as having appeared more recently than they actually did, which we'll refer to as hyper-recency. Okay, so turning to the data, what did we actually see? So we're going to start by looking at how people placed items that truly did appear during the original learning phase. So these are correctly recognized items. And on the y-axis here, we can see how far off they were from the item's true position. So a 0 here would reflect a perfect score. They absolutely nailed it. This task was pretty darn hard, so not a lot of people got a perfect 0. More negative in this case would mean that they remembered an item as having appeared further in the past. And a more positive value would mean that they remembered an item as having appeared more recently. And then on the x-axis here, we're looking at psychoticism score. So higher scores mean more intense psychotic thought experience. And for now, we're going to focus just on this leftmost panel, so the first study in this series of studies. Okay, and so what we see is that at lower levels of psychoticism, people were, on average, decent at placing their experiences in time. So you can see, on average, people's responses are hovering around 0, although you can see that there's this big range of errors around 0. What this tells us is that when people did make errors, they made them evenly in the more recent and more distal direction. So there's a pretty even spread around 0. However, as psychoticism increases, we see that people tend to judge items as having happened more and more recently. So here you can see that the majority of items are being mistaken as having occurred closer to the present than they actually did for people higher in psychoticism. This sort of hyper-recency that we described earlier. This exact same pattern was replicated in an independent sample in a second study. So it gives more confidence that this wasn't some fluke that we're seeing, but rather more consistent finding. So what about deja vu? Do we see a similar bias towards recency? So here we are simply replacing psychoticism with deja vu score as our predictor. And in doing so, we reveal a similar positive relationship with timeline displacement. So again, those with the highest degree of deja vu experiences were also more likely to mistake items as having occurred more recently than they actually did. And finally, when we look at this same analysis in negative symptoms, right, so low mood, low motivation, we see no such pattern. There's no such bias towards recency, and they look a lot like people lowering those symptoms, pretty even spread around 0. So returning to these three possibilities that we discussed earlier, we can see that both psychoticism and deja vu, but not negative symptoms, are associated with this third profile, where events are systematically judged to have happened more recently than they actually did, a sort of hyper-recency effect. So up to this point, we've been focusing on items that truly appeared during the earlier learning phase and were recognized as such. So these are correctly recognized images. But what about when people recognize images that didn't appear during the learning phase, which we can refer to as a false alarm? So in this example, someone might see this new image of a fortune cookie, and maybe they had Chinese food for lunch, or maybe there's something about this image that just feels familiar, but they say, you know what, I think this was old, I think I've seen this. This would be an example of a false alarm. And what's interesting here is that they still have to place these false alarms on the timeline, right? They still have to make that temporal judgment. And so we were really curious, how do people place events in time when these events didn't actually happen in the first place? So turning again to the data, we're looking at the same type of analysis as before, but this time on falsely recognized images, those false alarms. So the same logic holds on the y-axis, with higher values being more recent, lower values being less recent. And again, on the x-axis, we're looking at psychoticism score. And so once again, starting with people at the lowest levels of psychoticism, people judged falsely recognized items as having occurred further in the past, so before the 50% mark on average. This perhaps reflects an ability to recognize that, the memory trace for the stimulus was weaker, and perhaps infer that it must have happened longer ago. So sure, I recognize this, but it just doesn't feel recent. It must have happened in the earliest part of this experiment. Yes, psychoticism increases, there's a truly striking shift towards remembering these items as having occurred more recently in time. So just looking at these data points up here, people are using a lot of judgments above even that 75% mark. And so average estimates are landing above the 50% mark for people higher in psychoticism. And remember, these are memories for events that did not occur during this phase of the experiment. But people are making this judgment based on something other than a true or objective memory trace. again, this effect was both replicated in the independent sample, and it was seen in association with deja vu. So again, we see this parallelism between psychoticism and deja vu. And finally, there's no such association found with negative symptoms, again suggesting that there's something about this that's specific to psychoticism and deja vu. And so this analysis shows us that the same hyperrecency effect persists even for illusory events, or items that were not seen during the learning phase but were falsely remembered as such. And so to put this all together, what we seem to be capturing here is a breakdown in people's ability to organize their memories in time. But rather than representing a general disorganization or a systematic bias towards the past, recognized items were judged to have occurred more recently than they actually did, even if these were illusory events. Importantly, we see this identical pattern among people who experience deja vu more intensely, which suggests that there may be common underlying mechanisms that support both instances of deja vu and more psychotic experiences. And finally, we do not see this pattern appearing in association with negative symptoms like low mood and low motivation. So this gives us more confidence that we're capturing something specific to odd experiences as seen in deja vu and psychoticism, rather than more general symptoms or low motivation in the age of the text. So altogether, this study suggests that aberrant memory for recency may give rise to these sort of ineffable experiences, such as recognition without identification. And we think that we may be capturing a cognitive process that allows content to pop into mind with high salience, but low source information, and that this may represent a source of intrusive thought in both more normative contexts, such as deja vu, as well as in more distressing contexts, such as psychotic-like thought. And so for some, these experiences may be explained away as innocuous instances of deja vu, things that have happened to all of us in this room, most likely. For others who perhaps experience this type of thought more frequently, more intensely, or in conjunction with other experiences like perceptual abnormalities, these experiences may become incorporated into delusional belief structures that help to explain away odd occurrences. So perhaps someone's inserting this feeling into my head, like there's someone trying to communicate with me, or there's something meaningful about this feeling, or like, oh, I recognize this, but I can't quite place it in time. And I think that this question of for whom does that become a more distressing versus less distressing explanation is a really interesting and so far unanswered question in this literature that I think that Matt and Rick are going to touch on a little bit in their talks as well. And so returning to the model of the hippocampus that we discussed earlier, it could be the case that impaired hippocampal function causes an over-reliance on raw familiarity-based memory. So instead of being able to recall the chain of events in relation to one another, each experience is judged based on a more general, raw sense of familiarity. And so this would leave one vulnerable to the intrusion of items that are simply sufficiently familiar to pass the recognition threshold. So in other words, you lose the ability to make sense of memory content that comes to mind on the basis of its relevance to your current context. This could cause any and all recognized items to feel particularly recent, even if they are not relevant to the here and now. Importantly, this connects back to the phenomenology of psychosis, in which a common complaint is the disarticulation of time. So this is from a recent report on the lived experiences of psychosis that drew from first-person accounts. It describes how individuals live in an elusive and pregnant now, in which that which is most important is always about to happen. Further in psychosis, we often see the loss of the automatic filtering of irrelevant background information. So here, an individual describes their experience of psychosis and notes how it was shocking the amount of detail found in this new world. In a day, there are so many things the mind relegates to background information. And so we can think here of this memory system that loses the ability to sort experience based on recency, that may be trying to make sense of any and all recognized or familiar items as potentially meaningful in the current context. And this may represent one way that content becomes disorganized in time or fails to become relegated to the background. That experience kind of drifts off as time goes on. So this work may carry implications for intervention strategies. So for example, a deeper understanding of this process can inform interventions that help to build metacognitive awareness or odd or salient mental content, in which people build an awareness for ways that their brains may produce strange feeling outputs sometimes, and hopefully come to a less distressing explanation for these. This work also suggests that interventions that act directly on contextual or associative memory function, be they memory training or pharmacological, may help to reduce these instances of intrusions. Similarly, prevention strategies, such as reducing exposure to environmental pollutants that may reduced hippocampal volume may also prove effective. And finally, I hope that this work can act as a reminder to us all to move through the world with humility. People in general are doing their best to make sense of their experiences, and sometimes the systems that organize our perceptions of the world produce some odd results that we have to contend with. This can happen across a wide spectrum of functioning distress, in quote normal functioning that we've all experienced, and in mental illness. And it may be the case that similar cognitive or neural processes may even support these odd experiences across this continuum. And so hopefully, if nothing else, this work can serve as a reminder for us all to approach the experiences of others with curiosity and to hold our own models of the world with humility. And with that, I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Ty Cannon, and my many collaborators in this project, including Michael Bronstein and Dr. Brendan Scholl, as well as my committee members, my dissertation committee members, Dr. Yorman and Dr. Koller, and also Dr. Armachako. Joan has been an extremely invaluable collaborator throughout this whole process, which has been a multi-year project, and so it's been really cool to see this come to fruition. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Will. I hope you could hear that applause. I think Matt's going to take over now and introduce the next speaker, and then we'll have you back because I'm sure there'll be some questions. That was really interesting. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that brilliant talk. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rick Adams here in Oxford. Dr. Adams has degrees in medicine and neuroscience from the University of Cambridge, is a qualified psychiatrist, and has a PhD in computational psychiatry from University College London, where he also now works. He is a Future Leaders Fellow at the Center for Medical Image Computing and Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, and his research is focused on using computational models of cognitive processes and neurocircuits to improve our understanding of both the symptoms and the neurobiology of psychosis. And he will be speaking to us today about Bayesian explanations for delusions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for coming. Can people see this mouse in Hamburg? Okay, fine. Right, let's go. Welcome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular view of how the brain reasons probabilistically, known as Bayesian probability, and talk about how this has been applied to lots of things, in particular delusions and delusional beliefs. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides just introducing what Bayesian probability is, just very, very briefly, and then we'll move on to talk about delusions. So in the kind of 18th century, when Thomas Bayes was around, mathematicians in those days were not funded by the Wellcome Trust. They were funded in part by rich aristocrats who loved to gamble. And so there's a mathematics of chance and risk that came out of this. And so in that time, people understood a concept of probability called direct probability, which was, if you imagine this kind of lottery machine at the bottom there with the black and white balls in the drawer. So say you know how many black balls and how many white balls you have in the drawer, and then you close the drawer, and then you pull out a ball at random. And say there's an even number of each. Then the probability that you've got a black ball in your hand is obviously going to be 0.5, okay? That's direct probability, pretty easy to figure out. But at the time, what they didn't understand was what they called inverse probability, which is the opposite way round. So say you don't know the number of black balls and the number of white balls in that drawer, and you start pulling out balls at random, and say you get a sequence black, 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 white, black, and then you want to know what's the probability that there's an even number of balls of each color given that sequence that I've pulled out. That's a much more difficult problem, and the interesting thing about this problem is the problem that all of life has to solve. Because for sensory systems, for nervous systems, all they have are sense data, right? And they have to compute the causes of those data to which they do not have access in the environment. So they have the balls. They need to know what the causes of those balls that are being drawn are. So life ought to have found some way of computing or at least approximating this kind of solution. And the solution that Thomas Bayes came up with is his famous formula up here. I'll just explain what this means. So what it basically says is that the probability of some causes, say the distribution of balls in the jar, for example, given some data I pull out, are the product of two things. And firstly, we have this thing here called the prior probability. So do I think there's an even number of balls or not? Say somebody tells me, do I trust that person? That's my prior before I've seen any data. And then this second term here is known as a likelihood. And that basically says how probable are those data given this cause that I'm thinking about. So if the cause is true, are those data very likely? That's basically saying, are these data good evidence for this hypothesis or not? And that means, and if they are, and if my prior is very, very strong, then my posterior hypothesis that given the data becomes very high. And this is really the key takeaway message, that your belief in something after seeing the data is a product of how good the data are as evidence for that claim and how much you believed it in the first instance, your prior belief. Okay, that's enough Bayes. So people have applied this way of thinking about how the brain might compute do computations over sensory evidence in all different kinds of domains, in all different kinds of nervous systems, particularly over the last kind of 20 or 30 years. And there's a lot of evidence that life uses or approximates these computations in some way, because they're the optimal use of the information that it has. And so people have tried to explain a phenomena in psychosis using these terms, and in particular, delusions, for example. And so we've talked a bit about delusions. There are lots of imperfect definitions of them around, and this is the one that is used by the American Psychological Association. So in a nutshell, in a single slide, the Bayesian theory of delusions is centered around this assumption that the people's kind of strange posterior beliefs tend to come from some imbalance between how they weight information. So their prior beliefs seem to be underweighted or fuzzy. Their beliefs about the world seem to kind of lose weight in this equation. And then they suddenly perceive something that they think is very good evidence for one particular thing. So this is the exact type of phenomenon that Will was just talking about in his talk, where, say, you arrive at a bus stop and a bus pulls away, and you find this is a very significant event, and you think, that bus driver, he's got it in for me. Or you sit down in a talk, and maybe someone next to you looks at you in a slightly funny way, and you think, this person is trying to plotting to do something to me. Okay, so the idea is that you're underweighting your knowledge of the world, and you're overweighting the kind of sensory evidence of the moment in order to update your beliefs. Now, there is some evidence, and people have done lots of tasks that can kind of measure these quantities in patients with psychosis. And there is some evidence that this is actually that this imbalance does exist. But there's some major problems with it as a conceptualization of how delusions might come about. So one of these is that if you do experiments to see if people with psychosis overweight evidence of the moment, and you think that's because that leads to delusions, then you'd hope to see some relationship between how much they overweight evidence and how delusional they are. that you'd expect them to correlate. But they don't, or they don't really very consistently. It's pretty weak. And then secondly, a perhaps even more fundamental problem is that in this kind of model, it can explain why somebody might instantly make a conclusion about some event that happened. But notice that if you're constantly overweighting new sensory evidence, your beliefs should be kind of jumping around all over the place. They shouldn't settle into one very fixed, false belief that is irresistible to any counter-argument or irresistible to any new evidence. In fact, the exact opposite. In fact, delusions almost seem like an existence proof that the brain cannot be Bayesian. So what could be the problem with this model, or how could we change this model in order to explain delusions in a realistic way? So this is the kind of way that mathematical psychologists and computational people try to illustrate these kinds of models. I'm trying to explain everything as I go along. So imagine these O's are the observations that you can actually see, right? And these S's are the things that you're trying to work out, that you can't see, but you have to infer from the evidence. So these are like the proportions of beads in the jar that you can't see, in the drawer that you can't see. Or for example, imagine you're playing poker. These are the kind of bets people make and the cards that are on the table, and these are the things you have to work out, what people might be holding in their hands. Now, the problem is we are not passive belief updaters. We are agents. And this means there's much more stuff going on in our models than just simple sensory evidence and inferences about that evidence. So, for example, we take actions. We're agents. And this means we have confidence in our actions. It also means that we have habits. It also means that we have affective states. And it also means that we have states that we expect to be in, like goals. And once you start incorporating these more lifelike terms into an agent, you start to get different. They start to behave in a fundamentally different way. And the one important point is that these, if you construct a computational agent of this kind, then as time marches on, so this is time point 1, time point 2, time point 3, it's constantly updating its beliefs as it sees new things and it takes actions and things happen and there are consequences, etc. So you constantly need to update these quantities in the model. Now, how do you do that? So I'm going to put an incredibly complicated slide that I don't even want you to look at in equation terms. The point about this model is it's not a simple linear process where you get an observation, you make an inference about some state of the world, you decide on an action, and then you do that action. That image was the image that I was taught kind of 20 years ago when we were thinking about how brains might work. But when you actually try and build a brain that can do this in a Bayesian way, there's no such linearity to the system. So, for example, when evidence comes in at the bottom here and you're trying to work out what state is going on in the world causing that, you need to update your belief using the evidence that's come in, but you also update your belief using your current action plans, like what you're planning to do right now. Likewise, you update your current plans using information about states of the world, but also how confident you are in those plans. You also update your confidence based on actions that you're taking and states of the world. So the point of all of this is that there's lots and lots of feedback loops in these models. They're not a perfectly linear system. So this means that actions impact confidence, and confidence impacts which actions you take. And asking someone out on a date is obviously going to be highly impacted by confidence, right? It makes a big difference. Actions also affect inference about states. This sounds counterintuitive, but I'll give an example about this in a few slides. And then emotions obviously affect the way that you perceive the world, and the way that you perceive the world makes you emotional. So you have lots and lots of these feedback loops. This is just an example of a few in this whole setup. And in a recent paper that we published, I'm not going to show you any of the tasks or anything that we use because there isn't time. I'm just going to give you the take-home message. So if you have a model like this, just two things are required for this model to truly become delusional by those definitions that I showed you at the start. So one thing is a weaker link between the observations that the agent has and the states that it's inferring. So it no longer kind of trusts the evidence that it sees. Yeah, it's a bit more skeptical about it, right? And then the second thing that I alluded to already is the existence of all these positive feedback loops in the top part of the model that also affect inferences about states. And once this relationship to sensory evidence is weaker, then these things can start dominating inferences and can actually force the model to become truly delusional. So just to give you an example of some of these loops in action, without actually trying to, we just realized that this model explained various phenomena from the psychology literature going back decades that had been explained in other ways over the years. And so one of these counterintuitive effects is this effect on actions affecting your inference about states. Now, this seems kind of strange on the face of it. Why should something you've decided to do actually bias your view of what is going on in the world? So this psychologist called Jack Brame back in the 50s noticed that if you give people virtually identical mugs or pens, and you ask them to just choose one, the very fact that they've chosen one of those pens, if you then subsequently ask them how much do you think these pens are worth, if they've chosen one of those pens, on average, they will value it that little bit more than the pen that they haven't chosen. And the interesting thing about this is even if you ask them to choose blindly, so that you close their eyes, choose A, B, or C, A or B, and then once they've chosen one, even though they've chosen it at random, they still value it more. And the even more interesting thing about this is it's not just because it's in their possession. So if you ask a computer to make this choice, then they do not value that thing anymore. So the interesting thing is it's not the fact that the pen is in their possession that they value it more, it's the fact that they've chosen it. So why might this be the case? So if you're very uncertain about the value of two pens given their appearance, then you're going to have some prior belief that you're going to choose correctly. You're going to choose the most valuable option. That's how brains work, and that's how they make good choices. And if you're very uncertain about this mapping between the appearance of the pen, then this prior belief that you will choose correctly will affect your inferences about values of objects. This is just one example from the psychology literature of these kinds of effects. Another example is this phenomenon known as optimism bias, where states that have some affective charge, like estimating the probability that you will die of cancer, for example, will affect your inferences about those states. So people update their beliefs about good news much more than they update their beliefs to bad news, because they like the good news and they don't like the bad news. And again, this is another situation where we're not that sure about the mapping between these states that we don't know about and evidence in the world. And this means that in this case, moods can have some dominant effect on the states that we infer. And really the key point about this model is really that even though it's fully Bayesian, the delusions are arising not despite the fact that it's Bayesian, but because of the fact that it's a Bayesian model. And that is because in a Bayesian model, you're using all of these different quantities to try and estimate something that you're not sure about. That's the key to Bayesian inference. And if the model is structured in such a way that you can get positive feedback loops, then these beliefs start reinforcing each other and they can just take over the whole thing. Another interesting effect that these models had is we did in the experiment that we did, we had the model try to solve a kind of simple task. I'm not going to explain what that was right now. But then we had multiple settings of the model. We got it to solve this simple task, and then we assessed its beliefs at the end to see how delusional they were. And so this plot shows, if you imagine all the different values of this thing A. So this is how weak or strong the coupling was between observations and states of the model were. And this thing on the y-axis is the model's confidence in its choices. Again, the parameters don't really matter that much. The point is that you can see that we did lots and lots of simulations that perfectly tile this parameter space, right? It's pretty homogeneously covered. And you can see the colors of these simulations are the degree of delusion that arose with these different parameter settings. So you can see that with weaker A and higher B, you get more likely delusions here. Now, the point I want to make here is that if you plot all of the different beliefs that all these different simulations ended up with, on axes labeling how delusional they are, so this is how false they are, how certain the model was, how incorrigible these beliefs were, this plot doesn't look anything like this plot. This plot is all lumpy. Okay? The beliefs are all crammed into different corners. And these beliefs up here are the ones that you would describe as delusional. They're false, they're fixed, and they're highly certain. And so the interesting point here is that although we've chosen models that are very, very similar to each other, the beliefs that they come up with are really pushed into different corners of this parameter space. And the interesting thing this means is that really you can end up with a diagnostic category. These are the people, if these were people that you would label as having schizophrenia, for example, you can end up with a diagnostic category that looks totally different to normal experience, but it can emerge from completely continuous variation. You see, this person is not that much different to this person, but one has schizophrenia, so-called, and the other does not. So the interesting thing about delusions is really that they have no necessary and sufficient cause in this system. They come from interactions, risk factors in the system, and the structure of the system itself, these positive feedback loops that you get within it. And in this sense, as a kind of medical phenomenon, they're more like high blood pressure. In high blood pressure, if you get your blood pressure increased for any reason, and this could be a variety of different things, like your kidneys not working properly, or your arteries being a bit stiff, or developmental changes in your arteries. If you get increased blood pressure, then this makes the blood vessel walls stiffer. And then when they get stiffer, this increases the blood pressure, and you get stuck in this positive feedback loop. But you can get other causes of wall stiffness, like getting older, or being diabetic, or having inflammation. And they can trigger this same feedback loop without any of these causes up here. So none of these causes are actually necessary or sufficient, but it's the structure of the system and of the pathology that allows them to take over. And this means that this might explain why delusions and odd beliefs can be so heterogeneous and can overlap with other odd beliefs in the general population, because they're not down to one thing that is just there or not there. It's due to very complex interactions in this whole system. And so I just finished by talking about, very quickly, what remains unexplained. So I'm just going to give a few examples of beliefs that patients have talked to me about over the last year or so. So one was a man who felt his neighbor was making noise at night, deliberately, to stop him from sleeping. Okay, so in this case, we have probably a normal percept, but a kind of unlikely inference from this percept, right? Maybe she was walking around in high heels, but maybe she wasn't doing it on purpose. Right? Another patient said the way Justin Bieber had looked at her in a concert meant that he was in love with her. Okay, so this is, maybe it's a normal percept, but it's kind of unlikely that their kind of gaze locked during the concert. But even if it did, it's a very unlikely inference to make from just that one piece of sensory evidence, right? Another person said these voices that he was hearing come from a micro speaker that someone has implanted in his ear in order to make him mad. Right? Now here we clearly have an abnormal percept, right? And we have also a pretty unlikely inference based on that percept. If you started to hear voices and you Googled causes of hearing voices, you would probably not come up with this explanation as the most likely one, right? But even so, all of these you could kind of get out of the model that I was illustrating before. But then you come up with a belief like this. Moses is trying to have sex with me via Thames water. When you hear someone make a statement like that, you really have to, it implies that there is some fundamental kind of change in the categories or belief system of the person. I mean, sex is a many and varied concept, but under no definition that I know of is it something that Moses could have via Thames water. And this kind of thing is what the German psychologist and philosopher Karl Jaspers named an ununderstandable phenomenon. And this was his signature of delusions proper, or of true psychosis, that it was a belief that you just could not see how it could come from the sensory evidence of any kind. And this kind of delusion is something that these Bayesian models cannot explain, and are more to do with how knowledge is structured and stored in the brain. So, yeah, that's all I have to say, and thank you for listening.
Another great talk. Thank you so much. Those were two fabulous talks. So I hope everybody's got their thinking caps on and getting ready to ask questions. And Barnaby, you're over there looking at questions and telling me if you've got somebody. I'm going to start here in Hamburg in case we've got a question. Does somebody here want to start us off? Because if you don't, I'm going to go over to Oxford. It's your chance. All right, while you're thinking, wait, did I hear anybody? No? Okay, while you've got your thinking caps on, I'm going to go over to Oxford because we tend to have quite a few questions over there. Barnaby, do we have any questions in Oxford?
Do we have any questions in Oxford? Yes, we have a question in Oxford.
Hi, Marianne. Thanks very much for the talk. I have a question for Rick Adams. So I wonder why you took the DSM definition of the DSM-4, which includes beliefs being false, rather than the new definition. If there's any kind of reasoning behind that.
I'm ashamed to say. Can we fix the reverb on the mic? Oh, hello. Yeah, great. I'm ashamed to say I don't know what the new definition is. What is the new definition? Oh, it doesn't say they're false. Okay. Oh, I didn't actually realize that. Otherwise, I would have used that because I agree with that change. So one reason, I mean, no definition is satisfactory because they're just fundamentally too heterogeneous to be defined, really, in such a way. But it's quite. I completely agree that it doesn't make sense to have falsity as a criterion, because sometimes the point about the delusions is that they're beliefs which are that arise through alternative mechanisms, right, and not through the normal route of accumulating evidence, right? But there's no reason that a belief that you arrive at through some alternative mechanism ought to be false. I mean, you know, there's always famous quotes like, you know, I may be paranoid, but it doesn't mean that some people aren't out to get me. The Israeli ambassador comment from the 70s, I think. And so if delusions are not affected by sensory evidence, it does not it makes sense to define them with respect to that evidence. So the criterion of falsity doesn't make sense. I totally agree. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? This one thing. Can you hear me? Doesn't.
it doesn't stay. Can you? Oh, that's on. Can you hear me over there? Barnaby?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I still don't see. Oh, we do have a question here. Could you get the mic from Micah?
Hi. Hello. All right. This is a question for. I believe the first speaker's name was William. Is that correct? Yes. So perhaps this is a naive question, but your model, as you suggest, that it is possibly a deficiency in hippocampal function that causes the people with delusional experiences to over-rely on the saliency of the sense rather than prior experience. Perhaps it's a naive question, but just out of curiosity, the most famous case I can remember of a patient with hippocampal problems was patient HM, who had bilateral removal of the hippocampus. Did he display any kind of delusional thoughts or even a tendency towards more deja vu-like phenomenon, given that his hippocampus?
It's a great question. And lesion studies are a really interesting way at getting at some of these questions. And the answer is no. To my knowledge, that HM did not have any sort of paranoia, delusional phenomena, which I think points to a really great question, or a really great point, which is that hippocampal lesions, challenges, et cetera, are likely not a sufficient cause. And perhaps, as Rick alluded to, there might be no one sufficient cause, right? And so what we're probably capturing is, I kind of put the hippocampus forward as one important node in a much more complicated system that is managing salience attribution as a function of kind of like, past experience, prior experience, and memory function. And so I think that the hippocampus is a central node in a network of things that are going wrong to kind of make things feel both extremely recent and also, extremely salient, and in a way that then leads to, a bizarre explanation of that experience, which is another, again, one of those puzzles, right? Is that for some people, those exact same, odd feelings of recency might be explained away as a totally culturally normative phenomenon of deja vu. And for others, it might take on this more bizarre sense. But it's a really great point that I think that an important takeaway, right, is that the damage to the hippocampus itself is not sufficient to cause these type of experiences. So thank you for raising that question. Does that answer your question a little bit?
It does seem satisfied. Thank you, Will.
Great.
Do you have any other questions in Oxford?
Yes.
Yes.
Over here in the front. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for both of the talks. I have a question for the second speaker, and but I'm interested what you would say whether the mechanisms that you describe for delusions, these kind of feedback mechanisms, how they relate to what we might see in like non-disorder, non-disease, but still somewhat like vicious, epistemically vicious bad thinking. So what you might see in a conspiracy theorist who's not delusional, they certainly don't believe the thing about Moses and even that, but still there seem to be some kind of like self-confirmation and overconfidence going to be going on there, or like, you can list all kinds of like epistemically vicious thinking that seems to look similar, but also falls short of like disordered, delusional thinking.
So one key aspect of the acquisition of information that is completely omitted from that model, but which is fundamentally important for us in real life, is how the agent seeks out information. Because obviously in the task that we were the agents are fully informed in the task that we gave them. Everybody got the same information. But a fundamental problem in these days, and increasingly with artificial agents, is how to make them learn efficiently by looking for information, right? And that introduces a wealth of other biases, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So things like confirmation bias. We're not very good at at trying to. Can I show my old slide? Is it too much hassle to show my old slide? Anyway, in that Bayesian formula, you have that ratio of the likelihood to the normalized by the probability of the data, right? So it's how strong is the data as evidence for this hypothesis versus how likely would I have been to see those data under any hypothesis. People are very, very, very bad at figuring that out, that normalization. Okay, maybe if we'd faked the moon landing, some shadow might have looked a bit weird on some rocket in some photograph taken ostensibly by Neil Armstrong. But what are the chances that weird shadow might have been there just for some other reason, right? This is the point that is not appreciated by conspiracy theorists, is that they don't get that normalization term, right? And so a major factor in human kind of bizarre beliefs, I think, is because our information is extremely limited, we have to seek it, and our ways of seeking it are not good ways of arriving at a rational belief.
I'm just going to tell you that there's a bit of feedback, which we'll put up with for the moment, but if you could sort it out during the break, which is coming up in about 5 minutes, I'd appreciate it, okay? Because there's just a bit of feedback. Maybe, Rick, if you use the other microphone that you used, if you don't mind going over to that microphone, it might just be better. So if you get another question, if you could go over to the other mic, let's just see what happens, okay? Any more questions over here? Yeah, I've got a question there, Micah. Can you? Oh, there's one back there. Sure. Sorry, I'll come back to you. I didn't see.
I have a question. I have a question for the second speaker.
Are you on? Okay, can you go check?
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I have a question for the second speaker. You quoted Jasper in the end, and you said that he was saying that delusions are ununderstandable. And I was wondering if, even though they might be ununderstandable on a rational level, if there is might be like a symbolic meaning behind them, similar to maybe dreams or dreams, if the unconscious might express itself through these delusions that you gave examples to in the end, for example, with Moses and the water and so on. It really reminded me of dreams that people might have as well, just by while they are awake, maybe.
Got that one?
Yep. Now.
How far can that be stretched? So, for example, I once had a patient who was convinced that someone had murdered his father and was picked up by the police carrying a knife, roaming the streets. And we then subsequently realized that he was responsible for getting his father's medication from the pharmacy, and one night he had smoked loads of cannabis with his girlfriend. He'd not done it, and the next day his father had had a massive heart attack and died. And his overwhelming guilt about this event, he projected onto, other people because he couldn't deal with it himself. And so, that's not a so-called rational response to the event, but it was understandable in that context. But what I think Jaspers was getting at with his notion of ununderstandability was that really the concepts must be changed in some way for this person to be, for any reasoning to be happening at all. So, for example, I suppose I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine exactly what kind of. The problem with interpreting the problem with symbolism is it just goes it's unfalsifiable, right? There's just always an interpretation that you can make that means it's just fundamentally unscientific practice. And so when I say, you know, I don't think some can be explained through symbolism. There's really no way to actually conclusively show that. But I do think that some of the more bizarre beliefs are just make so little sense that they don't really seem to be credible even on the symbolic level. Although I do agree that some do make sense in that regard. Was that fair?
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I've just discovered, because of technical hitches and stuff, we're running late. So we have another question, but I'm going to take you first at the next Q&A, okay? So why don't we have our break? And Barnaby, can we get back for 6:30?
Yep.
And then we're 5 minutes late, but get everybody back in for 6:30. And please, if you can, I'll leave the tech guys to work it out. We're still getting feedback. So I'm going to leave you to sort that out when we have our cup of tea. See you in about 20 minutes. Okay? I want to introduce our last speaker, and it's our philosopher, and I like it. It's my colleague at St. Hilda's College, a fellow and tutor in philosophy, Dr. Matt Parrott. He's been attending these events for many years. I think from the beginning, Matt, pretty much? Maybe. Pretty much from the beginning, which is some years now. And indeed, he hosted this event in Oxford last spring when I was here at Hamburg doing the job that Barnaby is now doing for us tonight. Matt's a philosopher of mind and cognitive science and a philosophy of psychiatry. He's recently been awarded a very prestigious British Academy Award for a project entitled The Dynamics of Delusion, which he'll be working on next year. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks for having me out here. Thanks to Michael for hosting. This is like a lovely place to be, this room, so I'm really happy to be here. Can the Oxford people hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
It's super weird giving a talk online to a place that I work. Like, it's very, like...
Yeah, can you? Fine, thanks.
So I'm going to say some philosophical things about delusions. Some of what I'm going to say I can go through pretty quickly because it was already covered a little bit by Rick and Will. So there's two features of delusions that you see in lots of cases. So people with delusions have kind of strange experiences. A lot of the time they hear voices, they see things, they feel like their friends are strangers, they feel like people are kind of out to get them. And delusions are also characterized by having kind of bizarre beliefs. And we've seen this already too. This is the DSM-5 definition. It just says that they're fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. And they're deemed bizarre if they're clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers, do not derive from ordinary life experiences. But all of the sort of characterizations of delusions you get tend to highlight these two things. And the cognitive sciences, by that I mean computational psychiatry, neuroscience, psychology, all of them have sort of latched onto these things and thought, well, there's got to be a kind of connection between them. And we've seen that already in a lot of stuff the previous speakers have talked about. And so what I want to do today is sort of a couple of things. So I just want to sort of raise some philosophical puzzles for the standard theoretical framework for thinking about delusions. So I'm going to try to extract some just general things that people in cognitive science think in terms of their methodology, and just raise some philosophical challenges for them. They're not challenges that I don't think they can't meet at all. And then I'm going to say something about the way that people think about rationality in schizophrenia and in delusions. I think it's very common for people to think that people that have these kinds of problems are irrational in some way. And that's it's not really so much in the stuff that Rick was doing, but in some of the formal models, you see the irrationality is kind of built into the model. And I think that there's some reason to think that that might not be right. But the first thing I wanted to do was give you just a few examples so that we have a sense of kind of what we're talking about. So here's a kind of case. This is somebody who's kind of psychotic and schizophrenic. This is a thing that he says. He says, the game took on huge proportions. Not only was I convinced that my hometown was manipulating things, I also thought the nation as a whole was participating in fooling me. In Lake City, I thought adults were playing basketball in teams in the Civic Center for me. Nationwide, I thought the President of the United States was going to visit me, so I was very nervous in my apartment, thinking that he would soon arrive. After a few days when he didn't come, I decided he had changed his mind. Eventually, the game seemed to have gone just too far. I had needed to do something dramatic to stop it. The final straw was the morning when I woke up and felt the shadow of Satan was on my living room floor. Satan, I thought, was beginning to take advantage of the game. A couple more examples that are shorter. So Capgras delusion is a kind of delusion of misidentification where people think that somebody, usually somebody that's closely related to them, is an imposter. So here's a quote where a woman says that her son has kind of been replaced by a double. So she sees her son but thinks it's not her son. That can happen with your mother or with various kinds of relatives. And then there's a delusion that gets labeled variously Cotard syndrome or Cotard delusion, where people think that they're dead. So this is a quotation about a woman who was in a psychiatric hospital and repeatedly said that she was dead. She said she died 2 weeks ago. And obviously this was distressing because, it's distressing to think you're dead. So those are just some cases. So you have an example of the kind of thing that people are talking about when they talk about delusions. And the overarching framework for thinking about delusions in cognitive science is this idea that delusions are things that people adopt in order to kind of explain these strange experiences that they're having. That idea goes back in the history of psychiatry quite a ways. But it kind of gained a lot of popularity with this American psychologist named Brendan Maher. So this is a passage from Maher where he says that when you have kind of strange experience, it's something that demands an explanation. You want to sort of make sense of it in some way. And so his view is that delusions are just explanations that people come up with to make sense of funny experiences they have. So you hear a voice, you're like, what is that? And you come up with this kind of delusional explanation for the source of the voice. You think God's talking to me or something like that to make sense of the funny experience. So I want you to just notice that the last part of the Maher passage where he says a delusion is a hypothesis that's designed to explain unusual perceptual phenomenon, and it's developed through the operation of normal cognitive processes. So Maher's view is that delusions are completely explainable in terms of experiential abnormalities. So if you have a kind of strange enough experience, you'll just become delusional. There's nothing cognitively wrong going on. Yeah, he just thinks that people have super strange experiences and then they become delusional. But the basic idea there is that delusions are adopted to explain things. And that idea is still around. So the thought is that you just have to think of this transition between having a strange experience of the world to having a delusional belief as a kind of explanatory transition. And if you can clarify how the explanation works, then you'll have a full understanding of why the person becomes delusional. Right? So if you can understand how it is that somebody who starts to hear voices believes that they're having a discussion with God, how that could be the explanation they go for, then you'll understand exactly why they're delusional. The standard framework now in cognitive science is that a strange experience is not enough by itself to explain delusions. And there are lots of different reasons that people think this. So there's experimental data that's relevant where people have strange experiences and don't become delusional. There are various kinds of experimental studies done that look at the reasoning patterns that people have when they're delusional and think, well, those are too anomalous to be ordinary patterns of reasoning. And so the standard framework thinks in addition to a strange experience, there's something cognitively going on, right? There's some kind of impairment or bias or something like that. And pretty much all the Bayesian models that you can find fit into this pattern. Predictive processing theories fit into this pattern. And then there are lots of things that are called two-factor theories, which we can talk about in more detail if you want to. But the basic idea is just that you've got to talk about two things. So funny, strange experiences that are unusual, and then also something cognitive. So whether that is a kind of impairment to something or whether it's just a bias of a kind of extreme sort, there's some cognitive thing that's going on as well. So that's what people are doing, right? That's what all the scientists are doing, save for some, right? That's the basic sort of idea. And if you get both of these factors right, whatever they might be, then that'll give you the explanation of how people come to delusions. That'll answer the where do delusions come from question. Yeah. And you can sort of take your pick on to which things you find are more promising in terms of the second kind of factor to choose. So all I want to do is raise some challenges that philosophers might ask. And they're challenges that people can think about. So I think one, I've given them all kind of funny names. So the first name is this thing that I call the phenomenal challenge. So I think it's not obvious what types of experience actually call for explanations or call for delusional explanations. So you've already heard that most people have odd experiences at different points in time. So you might have a deja vu experiences. Most people in the world hear voices at some point in time or have some kind of auditory hallucination. So for you, if you do it, it's most common when you're transitioning from a sleeping state to a waking state. So first thing in the morning or right before you're about to fall asleep, people tend to have auditory hallucinations, like 75% of the population. And most people don't feel like those need to be explained in any kind of robust way. So I think it's interesting to think about what kinds of conscious experiences you have to have that demand explanation in the sense that this kind of framework is thinking about. And that requires you to think a little bit about what it's like to have unusual experiences. Some of the cases might be easier than others. So it might be easier to see how you think this person doesn't look like my son. But I have absolutely no idea where to start when someone says something like they feel the shadow of Satan on the floor. So there's going to be a range of kind of cases. The second kind of challenge is this thing that I'm calling the abductive challenge. So abductive just means explanatory, like it's a kind of inference that's explanatory. So we have this idea that there's a transition from having a strange experience to having a delusional belief, and the transition's explanatory. But why do people not select better explanations? So suppose you do have a kind of strange experience of your son or of your mother. They don't look quite right? So this can happen to you if like a person you know that haven't seen in a while so if you knew me very well, you saw me a lot, and then all of a sudden see me for a couple of weeks and I shaved my beard off. The next time you saw me, you'd be like, something's wrong with that kind of thing. So why don't delusional subjects select better explanations than the ones they do select? Why do they think like, oh, the person looks funny, so they must be an imposter. It must be a double who's replaced my son. It must be an alien or a robot. Those look on their face like not very good explanations. There's things you can say, but that's a kind of challenge. The final challenge is this thing that I call the implausibility challenge. So you remember that the definition I gave you at the beginning said that delusions are implausible. And one way of sort of putting the challenge is to think, well, why does a person even consider a delusional hypothesis as a kind of candidate explanation? Forget why they adopt the thing. Why don't they even take it as like a live possibility? So some of the things that delusional subjects think seem to be so so difficult to understand how anyone could think them that you might think, well, it's a bit strange that they're even thinking of it maybe people get replaced by imposters all the time, kind of thing. It's a kind of strange thought to have in the first place. So here's a quotation from a paper by Cordelia Fine and some colleagues. So she says that she's talking about delusional people. She says they explain the anomalous thought in a way that is so far-fetched that it strains the notion of explanation. The explanations produced by patients with delusions to account for their anomalous thoughts are not just incorrect, they're non-starters. So appealing to the notion of explanation doesn't clarify how the delusional belief comes about in the first place, because the explanations are nothing like explanations as we understand. So I think the way that I interpret that passage is that in an ordinary kind of case, if you have a kind of strange experience, the kinds of things you might think potentially explain it wouldn't include a bunch of delusional thoughts. You might have a range of potential explanations to choose from, but they would all be kind of less extravagant than the delusional ideas. So the thought is that you gotta explain how the delusional thought gets there in the first place, in a way. Explanation is demanding on your cognitive resources. Normally, when you have to explain something, you don't consider every single hypothesis as a candidate explanation. You wouldn't be able to. There'd be too many. And so the worry is that delusional hypotheses are so implausible that they're usually not even considered or computed in non-delusional thinking. They're not part of the system at all, even in cases where you confront a strange experience. There's evidence that this is just stuff about hypothesis selection. So there's evidence that we filter out contextually irrelevant hypotheses when we confront explanatory tasks. It's computationally intractable to consider an infinite set of hypotheses. And it's just a mathematical point. The set of all possible hypotheses is not well defined. I've said in some places that in non-delusional thinking, a person only considers hypotheses that are possible and compatible with everything that they know. That's a restricted set. And in delusional cases, there's a broader set of hypotheses that are even considered in the first place. So if you want to understand why someone forms a delusional belief, you have to understand not just how they select hypotheses and come to adopt an explanation. You have to understand how they generate candidate explanatory hypotheses. And that's not something we have a very good understanding. So I think each of those challenges highlights a point at which delusional thinking can look irrational. But if we meet them, then delusions will look less irrational. They'll become more understandable. They'll be not like the thing that Jaspers said. They'll be something that we have a better grip on, how they arise and how anybody could kind of become delusional. But I think some people think irrationality is just a characteristic feature of delusional thinking. And so if we make them too understandable, we're going to lose the heart of the phenomenon. So we don't want to make them too reasonable sounding. So here's a kind of quotation from a short book by Chris Frith and Johnstone, where he says that they're talking about schizophrenia. So they say sufferers from schizophrenia are irrational. They behave in ways that are impossible to understand. So that sounds like Jaspers. They're so irrational that we can't understand them. And delusions are often defined, not in all diagnostic manuals, but some, and in some textbooks, in terms of impaired reasoning or in terms of manifest irrationality. So it's just this thing that I think that people take for granted. And the last thing I want to do today is just raise some questions about that picture. So I want to give you 3 different cases where schizophrenic people with delusions look like they're more rational. Just so you leave thinking, well, maybe these people aren't as irrational as we think they are. So here's the first case, the jar of beads. If we had more time, we could do this. I'm not very good at performing the experiment. There's an experiment called the jumping to conclusions task, which you may have heard of because it's been done lots and lots of times. I'm going to give you just the first kind of simple version of it. So it's a task that requires you to do some probabilistic thinking. There are 2 jars. One, they have two color beads, red and blue. Jar A is 85% red beads, 15% blue beads. Jar B is the converse, 85% blue, 15% red. The jars are occluded, so you can't see them. Yeah. And the experimenter, me in this imaginary scenario, just starts pulling beads out of the jar, one at a time. It's just one of the jars. But you don't know which jar I've selected. And so I start pulling out beads. I'm like, it's a red bead. I put it back. Pull out a second bead. It's a red bead. And your job is just to tell me to stop when you know which jar I'm picking. Yeah? Does that make sense? So a kind of sequence you might get is, like 6 red beads. Or you might get like 7 red beads or something like that. And then you just tell me to stop whenever you want to. People who aren't delusional in this version of the experiment usually stop between 6 and 7 consecutive red beads. Yeah. So after I draw 6.5 red beads, you'd be like, you stop. That's the red dominant jar. Yeah. People who are delusional will stop between 2 and 3. Yeah. And so this is evidence that people with delusional beliefs jump to conclusions. That's the big take home. But the question I want to ask you is it really an impairment of rationality? So we've already seen Bayes show up on the scene already. If you put this task into sort of Bayes, like just a Bayesian equation, the probability after 1 red draw is that. The probability after 2 red draws is 0.97 to 0.03. So 2 consecutive red beads jumps the probability of it up to pretty high. Yeah, 3 consecutive red beads, it's like Rick probably knows the answer already, but it's like 0.99 something. Yeah, it's pretty high. Yeah. And so like the gains you're getting after 3 draws are very, very minuscule. You're not getting a lot more information. And so, I mean, Bayesian theory doesn't formally define a decision point at which you should stop. But you might think like, look, 97% is pretty good. 99% is really good. And so that's a good place to stop this, right? It looks like requiring 6 or 7 draws is the irrational behavior. You're asking for too much information. You're not learning very much. Case number 2, conditions. So here's the experiment. I give you some conditionals like this, and I ask you to tell me if they're good arguments or bad arguments. So the first one says, all buildings speak loudly. A hospital does not speak loudly, therefore a hospital is not a building. Case number 2, if the sun rises, then the sun is in the east. The sun is in the east, therefore the sun rises. You have to tell me, is the argument good or bad? Okay. The first argument's invalid. The first argument's valid. Yeah, but it's nonsense because, we're talking about building speak. That's a logically valid deductive argument. The second argument is a case of a famous fallacy known as affirming the consequent. So it's an invalid, logically invalid form of reasoning. It's a bad argument form, but it sounds good. Most people, meaning most of us, will say that the top argument's bad, the second argument's good. And it's because our judgments about logical arguments are influenced by how plausible the conclusion sounds. The conclusion of the bottom one, very plausible, so the thing sounds good. The conclusion of the top one, nonsense, so the thing's bad, right? What the study shows is that people who are delusional and have schizophrenia, they're much better at this. They judge valid arguments to be good arguments and invalid arguments to be bad arguments, regardless of the content of the sentences. So if you think classical logic is our best theory of rationality, at least in terms of certain kinds of reasoning, it looks like the people who are delusional are doing better than we are. Here's another case, same thing. You're given pattern of shapes, and you're given a rule. I don't know if you can read the rule. The rule is if there's not a red square on the left, then there is a yellow circle on the right. That's the rule. There are the shapes. What you have to do in this experimental test is falsify the rule. Make the rule come out false. So you can arrange the shapes however you want to. You just have to give me an example that falsifies the rule. For people who are not schizophrenic and not delusional, if putting not into a sentence ruins it. Like, people can't handle not. Yeah? People can do this if there's no negation in the sentence. Once you put not in, nobody can do it. Yeah? So the thing you have to do to falsify the rule is you have to put a shape that isn't a red square on the left. Yeah? But what everybody does is they do something like this. They put the red square on the left to try to falsify the rule. That's not going to get you a way of falsifying the rule. It's the same reason that people do badly on the Wasson card selection test, if you know what that is. Right? People can't handle negation. They just don't know what to do. But schizophrenic subjects are much better at this. They get 4.8 correct responses versus 1.8. 42% of them make only one mistake, compared with 11% of the non-schizophrenic population. 58% of non-schizophrenic subjects failed all 8 of the rules. Only 19% of the schizophrenics. Right. So again, they look like they're doing a better job. So all 3 of those cases show tasks where delusional subjects or people with schizophrenia perform better than controls. And they come close to approximating our best theories of reasoning. So by that, I mean like Bayesian probability and classical logic. So perhaps delusional subjects are not as rational as some people. Irrational. Is that what I said? Yeah, it was on the slide. Let's look at the slides. Don't listen. As irrational as some people have thought. So what does this mean? Well, I haven't said a lot, but one thing I think we should think is that maybe delusions are generally less irrational than they appear to be. I think that there are reasons for thinking that, other reasons for thinking that I'm happy we can talk about later. The second thing I want to sort of send as a take-home message is that in kind of everyday thinking, the way that we think about what's possible affects how we think about the actual. So the things that we think are real possibilities are the things that we turn to when we experience surprising phenomena. So if you're a person who thinks about possibilities in a very different way, it's not going to be surprising that you're going to maybe think about reality in a different way. The last thing I wanted to say is that I think that if we want to have a full understanding of where delusions come from, we have to think about the ways in which people generate possible explanations or generate candidate hypotheses. There's surprisingly very little work done on that. And I think doing a bit on that would help advance things a little bit forward. So thanks for your attention, and thanks for coming.
Okay, so my question is to Mr. Koller, and I want to clarify if I got it right. You said subthreshold psychosis, which I believe is the basis of what you present to us, like intrusive thoughts, deja vu, visual deteriorations and such, are similar to what like clinical psychosis is. And that way could be clinical psychosis could be treated as such, and this puts in a different perspective to what we perceive it nowadays. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm coming at this from a dimensional perspective. So the idea that what we call schizophrenia is a somewhat arbitrary threshold in terms of distress and functioning that we draw on a more continuous distribution of experiences. And so I think that my work is kind of informed by this idea that some of the same processes that may give rise to psychosis in the most extreme sense are present to an attenuated degree across a threshold. And so like in the middle of that, or in the middle of that continuum, you know, you might have people who have odd beliefs, but never quite reach that kind of threshold for delusionality per se. You might have people like non-clinical voice hearers, like there's populations that hear voices but aren't distressed by them. And then at the very lowest end of that spectrum, you may have people who, you know, don't have or have like very fleeting, you know, hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucinations, like when you're falling asleep or waking up, or maybe some of those deja vu experiences that we've all had. But the point is, yes, that there is this kind of like, there's this assumption baked into this that there's this continuous distribution of those experiences across the population. Some people have a lot more, some people have a lot less. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I have a question for the last speaker. Very interesting talk. Thank you. So I was wondering about the third point of the conclusion. To fully understand delusional thinking, we must attend to the ways in which individuals generate possible explanations. I was thinking in the spirit of the multidisciplinary nature of this event. What do you think, how potentially neuroanatomy or neuroscience could contribute to this? Because I thought your first example is Cotard syndrome, Capgras syndromes. Those are typically accompanied by specific lesions to brain areas that are related to body perception and face perception. And if you take this into account, they're not this like unexplainable anymore, right? These people have a disturbance of how they see other people, how they perceive them, and cannot connect the visual picture of the body to the person anymore. So it makes perfect sense once you know which brain part is damaged. I was thinking, I was curious, what are your ideas on how neuroscience could maybe help to answer these philosophical questions?
Yeah, I mean, so let's take the Capgras case a little as a case in point. So I think that one way that neuroscience can help is to help target the kind of experience that's going on in these sorts of cases, right? So if you lesion the brain and the person stops having kind of autonomic responses to faces, then the thought is it's like, well, that's part of what's going on because now they're having kind of strange experiences of faces. And if you have a strange experience of a face, then that's going to be unsettling. There are people that have brain damage that have that kind of experience that don't become delusional. So there's this kind of further question where we have to ask, well, how come? I mean, if we think that the experience isn't sufficient for the delusion, there's got to be something else going on. The question is, well, what's the other thing that's going on? And I mean, I think that I don't think that that too many people are thinking about that third part. I think that, I mean, if you look at the sort of, so if I had to put it all into sort of Bayesian language, this is a question about where the priors come from. So, like, how do you get the prior probability distribution that you get? There's a lot of computational work and like what happens with updating and things like that. But you might think, well, you got to get some strange priors in to get the thing to work in the right way. Maybe those things are learned from the environment, but I would like to know a little bit more about that. And I feel like that's something that neuroscience could do more on. But there's not a lot of people who are doing it. So I think, but I don't think it's just a subject that neuroscience could contribute to if they were thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
Any questions in Oxford? Dr. Dowker at the front.
Following on, thanks, from the question asked earlier about conspiracy theories, I was wondering at what point one might regard conspiracy theories as delusional, in the sense of at what point is this defined by how individual and unusual a person's interpretations are, or by how unlikely the beliefs might appear to the majority. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of how an American Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is rather known for statements that seem strange to other people, had proposed the theory that California bushfires were caused by Jewish-operated space lasers. And this is the sort of thing that would probably seem delusional to most people. Nevertheless, I mean, most in isolation, and most people who study delusions would probably consider this as a delusion. Nevertheless, this is somebody who's a member of Congress, who is regarded as accurate by a number of people, who is repeatedly re-elected by large majorities in her constituency. And so what, if anything, would you say differentiates beliefs of that nature from what are normally regarded as delusions?
The other aspect of that answer that I gave about conspiracy theories, which I completely neglected, is the social element. And it's really quite neglected, I think. No, it's not strictly true. In the last kind of 15 years, there's been much more research into how kind of social norms shape what beliefs and explanations we think are good. And they are extremely powerful influences on our beliefs. And really the other difference between conspiracy theories and delusions is really the level of idiosyncrasy as a clinician when you're assessing them. So, for example, if this person is in a flat Earth society and they get all their social input from these people in the flat Earth society, and all the YouTube videos they watch are suggested by other members of that flat Earth society, then you can quite see that this is, an abnormal sociocultural phenomenon, but nonetheless, you wouldn't diagnose them with a delusion. Whereas if this person had come to this conclusion by themselves using citing evidence that just doesn't seem to be able to be connected to that belief in a rational way, then you would think of it as a delusion. But the content could be completely identical, as you say. I mean, the space laser example is a very good one for illustrating that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Want to add anything to that?
I think what Rick said is right, basically. So all the definitions of delusions that we all saw are ones where delusions are kind of beliefs that are fixed and held despite evidence against them. And then there's this kind of caveat, unless they're culturally accepted beliefs or kind of religious beliefs or beliefs held by everybody in your community. And there's worry about that you might have that exception is ad hoc. Right? There's no reason to exclude those things because it's fundamentally the same thing going on. And then so you get these kinds of, crusades by people like Richard Dawkins saying like all religious beliefs are delusional because they fit the basic criteria. I think that's wrong because that is overlooking the importance of the social stuff that Rick is talking about. So I think, one way of thinking about it is to think like the things that you think are live possibilities for what might happen are kind of determined by your peer group, by your community, right? There are things that are compatible with what your background knowledge is, and that's determined by the social group that you're a part of. And so if you're in a group of people who all think like, there are Martians roving around and they might, I forget what Anne said, it's like they might shoot lasers down at any point in time. It doesn't seem that strange that you would think that too, because that's kind of what everybody's thinking. But if you're doing it all by yourself, then it starts to look different. So, I think that's right, that the social stuff is what matters.
Actually, that's why when I introduced Will and I took from his website, he said it's the delusion of the formation and maintenance of beliefs. that are out of sync with consensus reality. And I emphasize that word consensus. That's exactly, I think, what Matt's saying. It's the consensus everybody in the world, or is the consensus my group? I suppose you could look at it like that. But that's why I thought that was a rather interesting feature of your website. And that's why I picked it out at the beginning. So, do you have any more questions over there, Barnaby?
Yeah, excellent. We do have questions, yes.
Hiya, a question for Matthew Parrott. Given your conclusions from looking at the philosophy of delusion, would you suggest any methodological changes for the scientists approaching the study of these? For example, rather than the conclusion at the end of the second talk that some delusions are ununderstandable, to attempt to understand them in a different way using a different form of science, for example?
So there's, maybe you could say a little bit about what form of science you're thinking about exactly. I mean, I think that the last passage that Rick put up, where the person was talking about Moses having sex through Thames water, is a kind of case where it's really hard to know where to start with something like that, because one of the things that you get in Jaspers is this thought that part of the reason that delusions are ununderstandable is because the subjects who are experiencing these very florid delusions don't have a language that they can use to express what's going on with them. So Jaspers, in that passage where he says this, he talks about how, like, the delusions are significant to these people, but they don't have any way to convey the meaning of what's going on with them. So they kind of grapple around for words, and they try to use the words that they have, but those words aren't doing the job. And if that's right, then I don't know how to design an experiment to do much with that, but maybe one of the scientists has an idea of how to get around that problem. But if that's something like that's what's going on, then Jaspers' view is that you can sort of try to empathize with them as much as possible by talking to them, but you're going to encounter a roadblock at some point in time because they don't have the right kind of mechanism available to convey to you what's going on with them. I don't know if that was helpful at all. Like a bit of Jaspers. But if you have do you have any ideas about what kind of science, or like what? Science is creative. They can ask the scientists what to do.
Yeah, it's very difficult on an individual level to take a very, very strange utterance like that and investigate it scientifically, because you need lots of people in the aggregate to form statistically sound conclusions. But you can kind of get at these things. So, for example, you can look at the semantic structure of their knowledge and see whether the associations that concepts should elicit are the same in delusional and non-delusional people, to get a sense of whether those words really mean the same thing in delusional people versus non-delusional people. And there is evidence that they have different associations. The structure of their semantic knowledge is different in some way. So you could get at it that way. You could also do experiments to look at what kinds of hypotheses people are able to generate. I completely agree with Matthew's point about hypothesis generation, and this has really not been something that people have looked at over the years, but it's actually increasingly important now because partly because of the design of AI agents. One thing they are very bad at is generating new hypotheses that they haven't, for things that they haven't actually seen before. And one thing that would make them very useful is being able to do that. So there's considerable interest right now in trying to build agents that could do this, but it's not completely obvious how you should do that. But it's something that you could look at in people. You could give them scenarios, ask them to generate hypotheses, and see how realistic they are in an experimentally controlled way. So you could get at these things.
So we're all running late. I'm just going to ask if there's one more question at each end. Do we have any more questions here?
Just because I was thinking, I used to work as well with patients who tried to come up with a lot of explanations to what was happening to them, what they were hearing, what they were seeing. And I remember having one client who really tried to find an explanation and who kept saying that the things or the explanations he had were such big of coincidences that it was almost impossible that this is reality. So I keep wondering, are people who are likely to search for explanations are also more likely to understand their disease as a disease, because that would be the most simple explanation to what's happening to them? What do you think?
It's the simplest explanation depending on one conception of what you think they're trying to explain. On a different conception of what is being, so if what I have to explain is why this person isn't my son, but looks just like him. Mm-hmm. Me having a disease isn't a good explanation of that. Right. If what I'm trying to explain is like, why am I having these funny experiences, then me having a disease is a good explanation. So it depends on how the person is thinking about what the task is that they're facing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering about the link between memory and psychosis symptoms, as you were mentioning earlier. I was just interested in if you thought there were any underlying mechanisms that kind of linked the two, specifically in people who have experienced kind of traumatic experiences, and why some people may undergo memory loss of those experiences, and why some may then instead kind of develop delusional thinking, and why that doesn't always happen in both cases in the same person.
It's a really excellent question, and I think that there's a lot of, I'll try to be quick, but there's a lot of like overlap between trauma-related memory intrusions, right? Like re-experiencing symptoms, flashbacks, like these memories that are popping up that feel very relevant and very, very recent and very, relevant to the current context, and psychosis-related intrusions. And there's huge amounts of comorbidity between psychosis spectrum disorders and trauma. Many, many people that I've worked with clinically have experienced trauma, and that's informing how some of these beliefs that we would call delusional are forming and taking root. And so I think that if I had to, I'm going on a limb, I'm speculating, but I think that there's probably some similar mechanisms at play there, and by which, things that traumatic moments tend to be less associatively integrated. Like they kind of are these standout moments that don't get kind of pulled into a cohesive timeline of your life. And I think that those type of free-floating, and in this case, extremely emotionally salient experiences are more likely to pop back up with only a weak reminder, right? Or in times that you don't want them, because they are not locked down into this kind of this rigid backbone of our temporal experience. They're kind of floating around, and they're more able to emerge when we don't want them to. And in the work that I presented, we were looking at totally neutral stimuli for the most part, unless people have trauma about fortune cookies, which is always possible, but like relatively neutral. And so I think it would be really interesting to see if there's any differences in these, or similarities rather, in more affectively valenced stimuli or things that are more trauma relevant. Because I think you hit on a really good point. I think that there are those Venn diagrams are overlapping for sure. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to wind things up. Just going to say a few words. First of all, in a minute, we can all thank our speakers, because those were 3 fabulous talks. And I hope you'll agree that it was a really good example of what we're trying to do, of bringing together a philosopher, a psychologist, and a neuroscientist. Interestingly, they all converge on this problem. And it's, as usual, we pick problems which are difficult. There is no kind of one answer here. And people can work together to find solutions to difficult problems. And I hope the students and the A-level students are learning about that and will widen their horizons when they think about any individual topic. So I want to thank all our speakers, and I very much hope that we'll see at least you plus your friends at our next event in October. Will, thank you. Rick, thank you. Matt, thank you very much.